Hi, my name is Karina Akidal. I'm the managing editor of Canadian Auto Dealer, and we're here today to discuss JD Power's latest report on the impact of driving and vehicle ownership on the automotive service sector. So we have with us today JD Ney, Automotive Practice Lead at JD Power Canada. And so JD Ney, maybe you can jump in and let us know a little bit more about the report, so what it is in a nutshell and all the details. So I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, sure, Karina. Thanks for having me and having JD Power join you today. We really appreciate it. Today we're talking about our CSI long-term study. So it's an annual study that we publish, and it's at its core, it's an evaluation of ownership, behavior, service satisfaction, focusing in on individual Canadians that own vehicles between 4 and 12 years old. So for this year's study, we got close to 9,000 responses across the country, and then we used this study primarily for two reasons. One is to obviously evaluate customer experience satisfaction with working with both dealers, and in this context, because we're talking about owners of 4 to 12-year-old vehicles, we pull in the aftermarket experience as well and understand what that landscape looks like, as well as to help us establish an overall market share or market size for this really integral group of vehicle owners.
Perfect. So then I'll launch right in and ask the first big question, which is, what's the bad news that was discovered in this report for automotive retailer?
Sure. Won't let me start with the good news. So obviously, it was not a great overall picture, as I'm sure anybody connected to the automotive industry who has lived through the last 18 months would very likely already know. A lot of factors really came together, primarily obviously a global pandemic. Turns out that's not awesome for business. And so what we found is that in general, specifically for new car dealers on that side of this study, for a number of reasons, namely just reduced kilometers driven, people extending out their maintenance windows. New car dealers in general lost out on about 3.5 million service occasions year over year. When we take a look at how often people were bringing in their vehicle for service, how much that they spent. The lion's share of the decline in the overall industry was due to that just reduction in the number of service occasions. So once we aggregate all of those numbers up, we're left with a view that in 2020 this marketplace was worth over $9 billion, I think around $9.2 billion, whereas in 2021 for this study year, the marketplace again, service work on 4 to 12-year-old vehicles was worth only about 6.9 billion. So a pretty steep loss in terms of what this overall marketplace is worth.
So then I know the report indicated there's some good news in all of this. So what would that be for dealers?
Yeah, well, one of the interesting trend, for dealers, the good news at the moment is a little bit more muted. Although I think we're certainly not going to jump in and say the swing in service behavior that we saw this year is here to stay. And so what I mean by that is that this year we saw something of a reversal in probably a decade-old trend of more and more service share revenue moving away from the aftermarket and towards new car dealers. So, for instance, maybe 10 years ago when we were analyzing this data, we would have seen a fairly even split of not only the percentage of service occasions, but the total dollars spent split between the aftermarket and new car dealers from an overall revenue perspective. And over the last decade or so, new car dealers on a fairly consistent year-over-year basis had clawed away some of that revenue from their aftermarket competitors, to the point where last year, about 60% of all of the money spent on vehicle maintenance and repair in this group was at a new car dealer, and only 40% was in an aftermarket or non-dealer location. This year, the aftermarket had kind of clawed back about 4 points of that revenue market share, to the point where they're now up to 44% of total dollars spent, which is a fairly sizable reversal. That dollar amount that's worth about $200 million relatively year over year, so not an inconsequential amount of revenue. But I would say that again, because this is the first year that has reversed, like I said, about a decade-old trend. We're certainly not saying that this is the establishment of a new trend heading in the other direction. So I wouldn't be surprised to see dealers rebound and recapture some of that lost share this year, or in the coming year, I should say.
Now, I know the report also mentioned some key highlights. So do you have any tips that you can offer dealers? I know there's something around communication that may be of interest to them as well to hear.
Yeah, so I think first off, we should congratulate Audi dealers. They finished as the highest ranked brand overall in terms of customer experience and customer satisfaction. But overall, though, really, whether we're talking about new car dealers or aftermarket players, there's a new focus or a required focus on client communication or customer communication. Not surprisingly, when customers have to bring in their vehicle for service these days, there's a whole new set of processes and procedures that are awaiting them, depending on which phase of a global pandemic we happen to be living in at the time. It could be you can't walk into the facility, or you can, but you have to stand over here. You can walk in, but you can't be within 6 feet of somebody. You can wait or you can't wait. So it's a very fluid situation, and what we're seeing is that customers in general know that there's a process in place for them to follow. But what we hear from them is from a customer lens, it sounds something like, I'm not entirely sure what I'm supposed to do when I arrive at the dealership. I know there's a plan, and I know I'm supposed to do something, but I'm not entirely sure what it is. And at no point have we heard any of our respondents say, you know what, my dealer over communicated that plan to me. I'd like them to stop sending me emails in advance of my service occasion. We heard none of that. In fact, all we heard really was, I need to know what I'm supposed to do when I get there. And then that flows all the way through, frankly, to the method in which you communicate with your customers during the service occasion. In the not too recent past, most customers showed a preference for being called in the middle of the day to get an update on what's going on. And that's shifted now quite a bit to where about half of customers are saying, no, don't call me with that service update. That takes time out of my now work from home day. Just send me a text and I can respond to you when it's convenient for me. And so the import of that communication is still front and center, but how that communication is handled is really what's shifting.
Very cool. I'm also curious to know if you have any, if JD Power has any other studies coming up this year that dealers will be interested to learn about. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. So in Canada, our CSI long-term study is the one that is made public. So there's a press release and then a trophy. But for most brands, we also are currently working with most of our OE clients for our CSI study, which is a very similar study in structure to CSI long-term, although it's focused primarily on owners of 1 to 3-year-old vehicles. So that study came out a few weeks ago. As did our vehicle dependability study, which most in the car business are familiar with that acronym. It's the problems per 100 evaluation of 1 to 3-year-old vehicles. And then in November, we're looking forward to publishing, again, to our OE clients, the results of our sales satisfaction index, which I believe will be available in mid-November this year.
Perfect. And I guess just to close up the interview, what do you see or what do you foresee coming based on the study we did discuss today, moving forward, so say for the rest of the year, maybe into 2022?
Yeah, I think if I was to place a bet on the terminology I'm going to use most often with specifically with our consulting clients when we're doing performance improvement, like in dealership performance improvement work, it would be immediacy and minimal friction as a general theme. So what I mean by that is I would encourage dealers in particular to take a step back and take a look at their service process from a kind of a customer lens. And anything that happens in that customer journey, from booking the service occasion to arriving at the dealership, waiting to speak to an advisor, waiting to make a payment afterwards, take a big step back and figure out which of those processes unnecessarily adds friction to the experience. Because increasingly, I think brands that that will do well in our studies, and brands that frankly will do well from a service retention and profitability perspective, are those that will demand less and less of their customers, and kind of be seen to be providing a service that is frictionless, seamless, and very easy for their customers.
Great. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to do the interview today. And we look forward to seeing that the next study later this fall.
Yeah, thanks.